Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa. Recently, I was going to make myself a dress using this extra wide quilt back cotton fabric. And my main plan for this dress was actually to try out a new embroidery pattern. So I had already cut out the skirt when my plans kind of changed. Someone gave me this green gingham fabric, and the embroidery pattern that I was planning to try was meant to be done on a checked fabric with modifications for doing it on a solid fabric. And I decided that rather than trying to force the embroidery pattern to work on fabric that it wasn't necessarily meant to be done on and with a style that really wasn't going to work with it, to go ahead and change plans and do the embroidery on that fabric. But then I was left with the question of what to do with the already cut out quarter circle skirt. Then I remembered a recent request from one of my nieces. She had asked me to recreate this dress that she saw on the back of a CD case, and I offered to make it for her in pink as a Valentine's Day project. But for some reason, she didn't like that idea. And so I kind of labeled the whole thing as, well, maybe if I get a chance or I have a good idea for it, I'll do it. And, the whole idea got shoved to the back burner. Well, this blank skirt piece seemed like a good opportunity to go ahead and make not an exact recreation of that dress, but, something suitably ruffly. The only thing I needed was some tulle, so I ordered a roll of pre-cut tulle that's like 6 inches wide and 25 yards of it. And while I waited for that, I went ahead and started on the bodice. Now, I didn't want to do a slightly over the top skirt and then neglect to do anything on the bodice and just have it be plain. But I also didn't want both pieces to be so crazy that they were competing for attention. So I decided to use the Vintage Little Lady Maria pattern, which has these puff sleeves with just a small ruffle right on the hem of the cuff. And to add some more interest, I modified the front of the bodice to have a V-shaped yoke with just a small ruffle there as well. To do this, I started with a copy of the front bodice piece and drew a slanted line starting about the middle of the armhole and then going down to the center front edge. Then cut the pattern apart along that line and added seam allowance to both of those pieces. Next was cutting out the pattern pieces. For the most part, this is done just like the regular pattern, so I cut out 4 back bodice pieces, 2 sleeve pieces, 4 cuff pieces, and 2 sleeve ruffles. Then for the front of the bodice, I cut 1 out of the original pattern on the fold, that is the lining, and then I cut 1 of each of the new pieces that I had modified, also on the fold for the outer bodice. And then I also cut another ruffle piece, the same width as the ones for the sleeves, but slightly longer to go on that front yoke piece. So I folded the yoke ruffle in half and ran gathering threads along that long raw edge. Then I gathered and pinned it to the top edge of the lower bodice, which I had clipped a small notch into that center front dip, making sure not to go any deeper than the seam allowance. Then after basting that ruffle in place, I went ahead and sewed the lower bodice to the yoke to create the outer bodice front piece. Then I sewed on the back bodice pieces along the side seams as well as the shoulder seams and repeated that for the lining as well. Then I attached the 2 bodice pieces together at the necklines, clipped the curves, flipped them right sides out, and basted the armholes together. For the sleeves, I started by gathering the ruffles and then sandwiched them in between 2 cuff pieces and sewed along that long edge. Then I gathered the lower edges of the sleeves to the size of the cuff and attached it, sewing through only one layer. In other words, I left the lining loose. Then I folded the raw edge of the remaining cuff under and pressed it in place so that I can sew it later. Then I just folded the sleeves in half with the right sides together, of course, and sewed the underarm seam. Next, I gathered the top of the sleeve and sewed it into the bodice arm side. Then I went back and whip stitched the cuff lining in place. While I worked on the bodice, I left the skirt hanging for a few days to let the bias edges stretch out. Though in my experience with quilt cottons, they don't tend to distort as much as like the lighter weight fabrics do. I had cut the skirt with a back zipper already planned, so I had a front skirt panel and then 2 back skirt panels, and I went ahead and sewed them together along the side seams. My plan was to sew the ruffles every 5 inches, so with a 6-inch ruffle that would allow for a 1-inch overlap between the layers. So to get the placement, I started at the top of the skirt and measured down 5 inches to mark that line, and then I repeated that at 10, 15, 20, and 25 inches. Then I trimmed the hem at the 25-inch mark, which evened out the hem as well as just kind of made the math easier for me to keep track of. And then I went ahead and hemmed the skirt. Now, while waiting for the tool to arrive, I realized that I really did not want to gather all of this by hand. So I took this opportunity to try out a gathering foot. Once I figured out how it worked and I finally got my tool, I set about gathering all 25 yards of it, which sounds like a lot, but it's going to turn out to be not as much as I thought. So to make this step easier, I came up with a setup that I thought was a pretty good idea of putting the spool of tulle onto one of my cone thread holders. It worked for a little while, but what it ended up doing was the tulle just got really twisted. So instead, what I ended up doing that actually worked was just placing the tulle into the shallow middle drawer of my desk, and that allowed it to just kind of roll off very smoothly, and all I had to concentrate on was making sure the tulle was going straight through the machine. And here's all the ruffles. It is a lot, though apparently not as much as I thought, like I already mentioned, but I am still very thankful to have not had to do that by hand. Now I'm pinning the ruffle to the skirt, making sure to line that top edge up with the bottom line that I had marked. After sewing it in place, I realized that I definitely underestimated how much ruffles I would need to complete this, and that I wasn't going to have enough to do all 5 layers. So I had to debate what to do. I really didn't want to wait to get more tulle because I had already waited over a week because of a mishap with ordering, and so I decided to, instead of doing 5 tiers, just do 3. So every other line that I had marked on the skirt. And so for the next line, I did just go ahead and sew it straight onto the skirt without doing any pinning. The last ruffle was at the waist, and instead of sewing it to the skirt, which still had to be gathered, I went ahead and just sewed it to the waist of the bodice, only to the outer layer and not to the lining. I was still skeptical about my new plan for this dress, so I went ahead and kind of pleated up the skirt and pinned it to the bodice so I could get an idea of how it would look when it was finished. And then I got a second opinion from Mom, who pretty much said she thought it was fine and that having the ruffles on the entire skirt might have been a little too much anyway. So slightly reassured, though still not completely sold on the idea, I went forward with finishing this dress. The next step was ironing the skirt to remove the lines that I put on it earlier. Then I gathered and attached it to the bodice. Then folded up the raw edge of the bodice lining and whip stitched it into place. Then I sewed the raw edges of that back opening, attached the zipper, and stitched together the remainder of that seam. And here it is. Now, I was pretty much worried about the look of this right up until it was finished because I really thought that the missing ruffles might make it look odd or like I just ran out of ruffles, which, you know, I did. But I think because the skirt had to be gathered to the bodice, it kind of helped it not to look as odd. And in fact, the more I look at it, the more I like it and think that maybe the other layers of ruffles would have caused it to have like a bit of an odd shape. Although, knowing my niece, she wouldn't have minded. But I am curious what you think. Should I have waited and added more layers of ruffles, or is it fine the way it is? And as always, thank you for watching, and I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.